The Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle that ended the War of the Austrian Succession in 1748 left the war's European participants, like Great Britain, France, Austria, and Prussia, discontent with their gains, or a lack thereof. The treaty didn't do much to fix the problems that were brewing between these powers. The British and the French still continued to vie for colonial dominance. King Frederick II of Prussia's seizure of the valuable province of Silesia during the War of the Austrian Succession obviously made Austria quite upset. Despite limited Russian involvement later in the war, they felt left out because the French prevented any chance of Russia having a seat at the peace talks. Russia was also worried about Prussia, as Frederick looked like a challenge to their plans in Poland and the Baltic. During the war, France was put up against their old enemies, Great Britain and Austria. Great Britain held the region of Hanover in modern-day northern Germany, which neighbored the Prussians, who were allied with the French. Austria ruled over several territories in Italy, in which the French and the Spanish had an interest. Despite the alliances, nobody was really thrilled with their partnerships. The British had given money to Austria, but it failed to help. And even though the British fought hard, Austria still lost Silesia to Prussia. Speaking of Prussia, after grabbing Silesia, they made peace with Austria, which didn't sit well with France. Following the end of the war, the traditional alliances and rivalries fell apart. France started teaming up with Austria, and Britain decided to ally with Prussia instead. This change in alliances became known as the Diplomatic Revolution. The Diplomatic Revolution did not happen overnight. Much of the Diplomatic Revolution was attributed to the interests of King George II of Great Britain. George had a lot on his plate. On one side, he had to deal with his family's land in Germany, and on the other, he had these far-flung British colonies to manage. As usual, there was talk of war with France over grabbing more land overseas. However, if they wanted to fight France, they had to protect their interests in Germany, especially Hanover. France possessed their own colonies, and they saw a chance to invade Hanover if a war with Britain broke out. Despite this, France's Le Secret du Roi, a secret diplomatic game that France's King Louis XV was playing, worked on his personal goals that didn't always match France's official plans. Louis had his eyes on winning Poland-Lithuania's crowns for his relative, Louis-François de Bourbon, and he wanted to keep Poland, Sweden, and the Ottoman Empire as enemies against Russia and Austria. Austria and Russia had already teamed up to protect themselves, as well as Poland-Lithuania, from Prussia and the Ottomans. A secret clause included Austria gaining Silesia in the event of war with Prussia, but Austria's ultimate secret dream was to utterly destroy Frederick's power. By 1750, tensions between French and British colonies were boiling, and in North America, things were shaky. By 1754, the two started fighting at sea. Before they could openly fight France, Britain had to make sure Hanover was safe. They needed their navy's edge while an ally in Europe kept France busy. The British tried talking to Russia, signing a pact to protect British interests with Russian muscle. But secretly, they were also talking to Frederick. He was worried about Austria and Russia's plans, so he was open to British support. In 1756, Prussia and Great Britain, on the behalf of Hanover, signed the Convention of Westminster, promising to back each other up against an invasion of Germany. The British played both sides, which didn't sit well with anyone. The Russian Empress Elizabeth saw that the common enemy envisioned in the treaty could only be Prussia, and when the British rejected that interpretation, the Anglo-Russian relationship began to deteriorate. The French began to patch things up with Russia, and in 1756, they allied against Prussia. By allying with the Prussian enemy, Austria viewed their friendship with Britain as done and over. The First Treaty of Versailles in the May of 1756 marked a strong bond between France and Austria, beginning a new defensive alliance between the two. France now had the support of the Austrians, as well as the Russians. Though relationships died and alliances were born anew in Europe, the French and the British colonies in North America had been in open conflict since 1754, fighting over the big question of, was the upper Ohio River Valley part of the British, open for trade and settlement by people from Virginia and Pennsylvania? Or did it belong to the French? The French colony of New France ruled over much of the modern-day United States, west of the Appalachian Mountains and east of the Great Plains. This dominion then stretched into modern-day Canada, where the French had a monopoly over the Great Lakes and the St. Lawrence River. The British, on the other hand, primarily settled on the eastern seaboard in the original 13 colonies. The British undertook a more serious colonization program, with some 2 million settlers in the early 18th century. The French did not have such motivations, and the colony of New France, despite being geographically bigger than British North America, only had a settler population of a mere 70,000. For about 60 years, it was a bit of a standoff of who had the best claims on what regions, and how willing they were to settle the region to enforce that claim. Population booms saw British settlers beginning to encroach into the prime Ohio area, a region under the influence of the French. While the French were less populous, they relied on extensive trading and friendships with the local First Nations around those parts. But then, the French Governor-General stirred the pot. He ordered those British flags out of the Ohio region. Trouble started to brew. In 1752, things escalated. The British were ordered to retreat back into Appalachia, and when that did not work, their trading center on the upper Great Miami River was destroyed. This was followed by British traders in Ohio getting captured or worse. The government of Virginia then argued their claim on the Ohio was older and stronger than France's claim. They were so into this idea that they already gave away 2,300 square miles of land to settlers there. When news broke that the French were enforcing their claim, a young George Washington was sent to the French Fort Le Boeuf in 1753 to tell them they were on Virginia's land. When this failed, Virginia got busy building a fort at the convergence of the Allegheny and Monongahela rivers on the site of modern-day Pittsburgh, but the French overran it and renamed it Fort Duquesne. George Washington, assuming the command of a militia force, entrenched himself at Fort Necessity, some 64 kilometers from Fort Duquesne. After annihilating a French scouting party, Washington's men were besieged in the July of 1754. Outnumbered by the French and their indigenous allies, Washington ultimately surrendered the fort. Virginia appealed to a reluctant King George II, who adopted a policy of "let Americans fight Americans." Still, the British sent General Edward Braddock to kick the French out of Fort Duquesne. The first 4 years of the war in North America saw British loss after loss. Braddock got ambushed and killed in 1755, and things went downhill from there. British forts in New York and New England were surrendering left and right. The only notable British victory was the capture of Fort Beauséjour in 1755, protecting the narrow isthmus between modern-day New Brunswick and Nova Scotia. The French-speaking settlers of the region, called Acadians, refused to swear an oath of loyalty to the British. Rather than guard the area with valuable manpower, British authorities from Halifax decided to begin a massive deportation campaign that scattered and decimated the largely pro-French Acadian population in what became known as the Great Upheaval. The buildup of alliances in Europe saw both Russia and Austria mobilizing troops to counter Frederick. Frederick's pleas for good-willed Austrian intention were left ignored by the Austrian Archduchess, Maria Theresa. So, on August 29, 1756, Frederick led his army into Saxony, on the way to Austria's Bohemian frontier. With 70,000 soldiers, Frederick's men marched into the Saxon capital of Dresden a little over a week later. The Saxon army, with only 20,000 soldiers, falls back to the town of Pirna. Frederick makes a promise of good intentions to the Saxon elector, Frederick Augustus, and his minister, Heinrich von Brühl. Naturally, they're distrustful. Austria saw this as an opportunity and sent 32,000 troops to help the Saxons under the command of Maximilian Ulysses, Reichsgraf Braun. Frederick heads south into Bohemia to counter this. At Lobositz, Frederick's force crushes Braun's Austrian army. With victory secured, Frederick heads back to Saxony and makes the Saxons surrender at Pirna on October 16th. The Saxon leaders, Frederick Augustus and Brule, decided to step away to their Kingdom of Poland. Prussia returned to Bohemia in the April of 1757, and they scored a win at the Battle of Prague over a renewed Austrian force under Braun. But then, in June, Prussia lost at the Battle of Kolin. The Austrians forced the Prussians out of Prague and out of Bohemia. The French and the Russians began to dispatch armies to finally crush Prussia. 100,000 French troops descended into Germany. After defeating a Hanoverian force at Hastenbeck in July, the French general Louis-François Armand du Plessis, the Duke of Richelieu, began to advance on Prussia's western frontier. Russia began crossing through Polish territory into Prussia starting in May with a similarly sized army. They score a win at the Battle of Gross-Jägersdorf, but surprisingly, the Russians retreat. Nonetheless, the war looked grim for Frederick. Frederick decides to face the Western threat first, attempting to prevent Richelieu from combining with other Austrian and Saxon forces. Frederick gathers a Prussian force of about 25,000 troops, half the size of the army he aims to intercept. This was a pivotal moment for him, a chance to redeem his fortunes after the Battle of Kolin. After gathering at the city of Leipzig, the Prussian army marched toward the town of Weissenfels on the Saale River by October 31st, 1757. November 3rd saw Frederick's forces cross the Saale downstream via a bridge of boats, uniting with detached Prussian troops. Approaching the nearby village of Rossbach, Frederick encountered a combined French and Austrian force of around 41,000 soldiers, though rumors exaggerated their numbers to 60,000. Facing them, his Prussian army stood at 21,000 strong, less than half the size of the opposing force. The Prussians set up camp between Bedra and Rossbach. The French camp echoed with music and celebration, as they assumed that the Prussians were recoiling. Yet Frederick held his ground. He knew that the French and the Austrians were grappling with dwindling supplies, their situation growing dire. As the sun dawned on November 5th, 1757, the French and Austrians prepared to launch an assault on the outnumbered Prussians, their columns forming in unwieldy formations. The French commander, Prince Soubise, miscalculated in the presence of Frederick's aggressive genius. The French army was ill-prepared, its drill lacking, its regiments spreading out as they marched, filled with distracting excitement and chatter. Prussian cavalry struck a devastating blow against the Austrian cuirassiers and hussars. The Prussian infantry, a formidable force, fired volleys into the leading enemy columns. The advancing columns dissolved into chaos, unable to withstand the fierce Prussian assault. A second cavalry charge further exacerbated the chaos, and the combined efforts of Prussian infantry and cavalry sent the French and Austrian troops fleeing or surrendering. The field was a scene of pandemonium. A French witness painted the chaos vividly. Everybody sank into a mob. It was not possible to prevent the flight. The Prussian infantry followed on our heels and fired without checking its advance or having a man drop out of rank or file. The artillery bombarded us without pause. As darkness descended by 5 p.m., the battle concluded. Frederick sought refuge in the nearby castle of Schloss Burgwerben, only to find wounded French officers within its walls. He settled in a nearby house, his mind likely buzzing with the magnitude of this victory. Frederick's victory at Rossbach that day came at, surprisingly or not, a very low cost. In less than 2 hours of fighting, the Prussian losses numbered a mere 548, while the French suffered greatly with 6,600 killed, wounded, and captured. The Austrian toll was 3,552. The Battle of Rossbach was a decisive turning point for the war in Europe. Frederick's victory convinced the British government to play a more supportive role in Germany, transferring command of their Hanoverian forces to Frederick's brother-in-law, Field Marshal Ferdinand of Brunswick. While Frederick was busy in the west, Austrian troops began an offensive into Silesia. The Austrians managed to capture Schweidnitz on November 11th. Then, on November 22nd, they secured Breslau. Frederick hurriedly moved his troops with the momentous Battle of Leuthen on December 5, 1757, effectively ending the Austrian campaign. Like at Rossbach, Frederick was nearly outnumbered 2-1, but still achieved victory with fewer losses. Not long after, the Prussians reclaimed Breslau. In the autumn of 1757, a Scottish emigrant serving in the Russian military, William Fermor, was put in command. On January 22, 1758, he captured Königsberg, the capital of East Prussia. However, as spring arrived, thawing snow made northern roads impassable, temporarily immobilizing Fermor's forces. Meanwhile, Ferdinand of Brunswick, along with his Anglo-Hanoverian troops, launched a successful offensive against the French in Westphalia. Crossing the Rhine River on March 27th, they secured a victory against a larger French force at Krefeld on June 23rd. This triumph enabled them to control northwestern Germany. After the Austrians were crippled at Leuthen, Frederick launched a new offensive in Silesia. He then moved into the region of Moravia to besiege the city of Olmütz. Unfortunately, Austrian pressure on his supply lines forced Frederick to abandon the siege in July. To evade the Austrians, Frederick led his troops northwestward into Bohemia and then northward across Silesia. The Russian forces, led by Fermor, laid siege to Kustrin on August 15th. However, by August 20th, Frederick had positioned himself in Frankfurt an der Oder. On August 25th, with a force of 36,000, he launched an attack on the Russians at Zorndorf. This brutal battle, the deadliest of the war, resulted in significant losses for both sides and turned out inconclusive. The Austrian commander, Leopold Joseph, the Count of Daun, and his unexpected attack on October 14th at Hochkirch caught the Prussians off guard, resulting in a costly victory for him. While Frederick managed to retreat to Silesia, Daun's subsequent retreat to Pirna was prompted by news of Frederick's approach. Starting in December, a third Treaty of Versailles was drafted between France and Austria. By the March of 1759, they officially signed it, and a couple of months later in May, it was ratified. The Third Treaty of Versailles reduced French commitments to Austria. However, the French were still responsible for keeping around 100,000 soldiers in Germany. On April 13th, Ferdinand of Brunswick's advance against the French in southwest Germany was defeated by the French commander Victor François, 2nd Duke of Broglie, at the Battle of Bergen. By July, Broglie took control of Minden. Minden helped open a path into Hanover. Ferdinand tricked the French into a fight in August. Thanks to some unexpected luck and the stubbornness of the British soldiers, the French suffered defeat at the Battle of Minden. By letting go of their Austrian commitments, France could pursue the war with Great Britain with greater vigor. France started to construct a plan to invade Great Britain. To make this happen, they needed their fleets to help their troops cross the English Channel. They called upon their Mediterranean fleet from Toulon to join their Atlantic fleet at Brest, in northwest France. The British were able to intercept the French Mediterranean fleet off the Portuguese coast, attacking and scattering it at the Battle of Lagos on August 19th. After another British fleet withdrew from their blockade of Brest, France's Atlantic fleet was crushed at the Battle of Quiberon Bay in late November. Not only was the planned invasion scrapped, but British naval superiority was established for the remainder of the war. Because of all these victories, the British government felt pretty confident and started talking about peace with the French. The terms the British offered were so tough that the French met them with refusal. Furthermore, Austria and Russia strongly objected to the idea of France making a separate peace with the British. While the French planned their invasion, the Russians switched their commander from William Fermor to Pyotr Saltykov in May. They marched with 70,000 soldiers through Poland and reached Brandenburg. There, Saltykov confronted Prussians at Zulikow on July 23rd. The outcome was clear. Saltykov's forces, numbering 70,000, defeated the Prussians' 26,000. From there, Saltykov pressed ahead along the Oder River toward Frankfurt. At the same time, Daun dispatched 35,000 Austrians northward from Saxony to support him. Frederick, who had been battling Daun, quickly maneuvered to thwart the Austro-Russian partnership, but his efforts were in vain. Frederick then united with another Prussian army, this one commanded by Friedrich August von Fink. With around 50,000 troops, he began a daring assault on the combined Austro-Russian position at Kunersdorf on August 12th. The result, however, was disastrous for Frederick, as he lost over 18,000 men in just 6 hours. Oddly, Saltykov didn't immediately capitalize on his triumph, and Daun, with the Austrians, exploited the weakened Prussian forces in Saxony. This led to the fall of Dresden on September 14th. Although Daun and Saltykov wanted to coordinate their efforts, Frederick's clever tactics after the Kunersdorf defeat frustrated their plans. Saltykov's need for supplies forced him to withdraw, allowing Frederick to turn back against Daun. Sending more than 12,000 troops to attack Daun's rear, Fink was instead taken by surprise when confronted by 42,000 of Daun's men at Maxen and had to surrender on November 21st. The year had been a bad one for Frederick. Though the war raged in Europe, it also occurred throughout the world, spanning a total of 5 continents. One region that was particularly affected was India. Starting in the year 1600, the East India Company, or the EIC, came to life. The EIC was Britain's colonial strong arm in India. The EIC became powerful, funding their own army and also hiring help from the real British Army. By the 1750s, they wanted more. They wanted to control land too. Around this time, a man named Robert Clive was already proving himself. In 1751, he showed some impressive skills at Arcot, holding off a long 52-day siege. He also nailed a victory in Arni later that year. Clive knew his artillery too, handling the artillery at Trichinopoly in 1752. He was climbing up the ranks. During this time, Bengal, a region in India and a vassal of the ailing Mughal Empire, was causing trouble for the company. Bengal got itself a new ruler in 1756, Nawab Siraj-ud-Dowlah. Adopting a pro-French stance, Siraj-ud-Dowlah wanted the EIC out of his land. In the June of 1756, Siraj-ud-Dowlah marched on the EIC's fort in Calcutta. After a short siege, Calcutta fell. Some EIC soldiers and citizens were caught and were stuck in this awful, dark, and cramped prison called the Black Hole of Calcutta. Nearly all of them suffered from dehydration and the scorching heat, and most died. A full-blown war with the EIC was now inevitable. Clive was sent to take back Calcutta and then topple Siraj-ud-Dowlah. Discontent followers of Siraj-ud-Dowlah began to defect to the British, like Mir Jafar, who was secretly paid off to join the British. Clive moved forward to the Bengali capital, Murshidabad. At Plassey, near the Bhagirathi River, he faced off with the Bengali army on June 23, 1757. The Bengalis had 50,000 soldiers, mostly foot soldiers with old muskets. The French gave them some artillery backup, making more than 50 cannons. On Clive's side were about 3,000 troops and a tiny artillery group. The French and Bengali cannons started firing first, followed by the British guns. Clive's shots missed the cannons but hit the nearby cavalry. When the Bengali infantry moved in, Clive's guns and muskets started firing. Mir Jafar, with a chunk of the Bengali army, sat on the side without fighting, even though Siraj-ud-Dowlah begged him to help. The fight seemed to be a stalemate until it started to rain. Clive's crew had tarps to keep their gunpowder dry, but the Bengalis didn't. Thinking the British guns were wet and useless, Siraj-ud-Dowlah's cavalry charged. But Clive's guns shot back, slaughtering them. With his troops scattered and retreating, Siraj-ud-Dowlah began to retreat too. Clive won the Battle of Plassey with fewer than 100 casualties. They captured Siraj ad-Dawla, executed him, and the EIC installed Mir Jafar as the puppet ruler of Bengal. The victory at Plassey allowed the EIC to milk Bengal's resources while having zero responsibility in footing the bills of administration. Robert Clive became famous and rich, becoming the governor of Bengal, and started the EIC's territorial rule in India. The war in North America did not end with the outbreak of hostilities in Europe in 1756 either. If anything, it intensified. The British were much keener in curbing France's trade and colonial power throughout North America, the Caribbean, Africa, and India. With the capture of the French port of Louisbourg in 1758, in modern-day Nova Scotia, British ships could sail up the St. Lawrence River and penetrate deep into New France. James Wolfe was assigned to capture the fortress city of Quebec starting in 1759. Wolfe's expeditionary force had more than 8,000 soldiers from Britain, about 900 from America, and 2,100 Royal Marines. On the other side, the folks in Quebec had over 18,000 soldiers. Most of them were irregular Canadian militia, not super experienced in battles. The French had around 5,600 professional troops. Plus, nearly 1,800 indigenous warriors joined in. In the June of 1759, Wolfe and his men landed near Quebec. They captured the Ile d'Orléans outside of the city, as well as spots directly across from the city. The French had their defenses set up at Beauport, with a river protecting them. Any potential attack would require taking the fort, as well as combating the St. Lawrence's strong currents. The British tried attacking in July, but had to back off. In August, some British ships got past the French cannons and parked upriver. This allowed Wolfe to land an invasion force upstream from Quebec to cut it off from the city of Montreal, upriver from Quebec. In the early hours of the 13th of September, Wolfe landed 3 kilometers upriver of Quebec, at the base of a cliff. It was tricky, but they managed to land in the dark and climb up the cliff in secrecy. By sunrise, Wolfe and a force of 4,500 men were ready to do battle at the Plains of Abraham, just outside of the city. When Montcalm, the French commander, heard about the British landing, he attempted to attack as quickly as he could with a similarly sized force. The first shots of the battle that day rang out, not from the French troops, but from the skilled indigenous marksmen that lined the bushes along the British flanks. Right at the start of the fighting, Wolfe got hit 3 times and died quickly. With the death of other important British officers, the British attack began to lose its direction. Brigadier General George Townshend took control and got 2 battalions of soldiers ready to against a French relief force that was coming from behind. Aided by French reluctance, the British made their position stronger on higher ground. This let Montcalm's troops retreat, but Montcalm himself got hurt. He died the next morning. With victory secured, the British laid siege to Quebec, and on September 18th, the French gave up and handed the city to the British. Despite victory, the British in Quebec weren't safe from the elements. Soon after the battle, the British ships had to leave before the St. Lawrence River froze. This left the British in Quebec all alone for the winter, and many of them got sick with scurvy. Defeat looked inevitable when, in the April of 1760, the French marched with 7,000 soldiers to Quebec. On April 28th, the French beat the British in the Battle of Sainte-Foy, near the city. This time, the British backed off and stayed in Quebec while the French surrounded them. But in mid-May, the British ships came back, and the French retreated to Montreal. With the destruction of the French fleet at Quiberon Bay, no help would come for New France. On September 8, 1760, Montreal gave up to the British. Meanwhile, in Europe, Russia and Austria had their eyes on Silesia for their 1760 campaign. In June, Ernst Gideon von Laudon, an Austrian commander, dealt a blow to the Prussians at Landeshut and later captured Glatz in July. Frederick and his forces were on their toes, keeping an eye on both Loudon in Silesia and Daun in Saxony. In July, Frederick initially moved to confront Loudon, but then switched gears to besiege Dresden after learning Daun was joining Loudon. Yet, Frederick's quick thinking tricked the Russian commander Zakhar Grigorievich Chernyshev into withdrawing from Silesia, causing the Austro-Russian plan for victory in Silesia to crumble. Meanwhile, out west, Broglie and Ferdinand took turns winning and losing battles. Ferdinand secured Hanover against the French, but his attempt to cross the Rhine hit a wall at Klosterkamp. With the death of King George II of Great Britain, his grandson, George III, took the throne. The new king had his own agenda, less keen on the Anglo-Prussian alliance. By the March of 1761, the members of the anti-Prussian coalition weren't on the same page. France sought peace, Austria wanted talks for Silesia, and Russia aimed to dismantle Prussia. British-French talks went south due to disagreements regarding continued support for Prussia and Britain's colonial conquests. Back to the fighting, Ferdinand and Broglie kept clashing, with Ferdinand having his share of victories. In Prussia, Frederick desperately worked to prevent the Austrian and Russian forces from uniting in Silesia. Eventually, they linked up, and Frederick was in a tight spot. But he dug in at Bunzelwitz, and the enemy hesitated to attack. When the Russians pulled out, Frederick turned towards Brandenburg. Though Prussia had its ups and downs in Saxony and Pomerania, worried about the possibility of the lack of British support, a big twist came in early 1762. Empress Elizabeth died, and her successor, Peter III, succeeded the throne. Peter was, notably, quite fond of Frederick and very pro-Prussian. This was a game changer. Peter made peace with Frederick in May. Peter's reign did not last long, and when he was assassinated in July, Peter's wife, Catherine II, took to the throne. Fortunately for Frederick, she didn't restart the war. Back on the battleground, Daun took over for Austria in Silesia. Both sides clashed near Schweidnitz, with Frederick trying to recapture it and Daun trying to save it. After the Prussians scored a victory at Freiburg in late October, Austria and Prussia signed an armistice. Russia's departure from the fight made Austria rethink the war. France followed suit, and peace negotiations began. On November 3, 1762, even before the Austro-Prussian armistice, Britain and France signed a peace agreement at Fontainebleau, marking the beginning of the end of the 7 Years' War. The Treaty of Paris, signed on February 10, 1763, between Great Britain, Hanover, France, Spain, and Portugal, all sat down and signed on the dotted line. Notably, no territorial exchanges were made in Europe. However, the same cannot be said for North America. Britain took all of mainland North America on the east side of the Mississippi River, except for the port city of New Orleans. The West Indian islands like Grenada, St. Vincent, Dominica, and Tobago were also taken by Britain. The EIC received all of France's conquests in India and the East Indies in Asia. Spain was given the rest of New France west of the Mississippi, including New Orleans. The second treaty, the Treaty of Hubertusburg between Austria, Prussia, and Saxony, was signed on February 15, 1763. Negotiations had kicked off on New Year's Eve of 1762. In the end, things went back to how they were in 1748. The 7 Years' War in Europe and the French and Indian War in North America was perhaps the most consequential conflict in the 18th century. The end of the 7 Years' War set France on a path to self-destruction. They lost colonies left and right, their power tanked, and they were out of the colonial empire race. The French king, Louis XV, and his monarchy spiraled into corruption and decadence. France's money situation was pretty dire. Borrowing money left and right to cover war costs brought them to the edge of bankruptcy. Attempts to fix these issues degraded into the anarchic chaos of a bloody revolution by the end of the century. Frederick and the Kingdom of Prussia came out of the war standing tall, holding on to Silesia despite the odds. Frederick was a national hero, and Prussia was now able to flex its muscles as a great power in Europe. But size-wise, Prussia was still a bit small compared to the big shots like Austria, France, and Russia, so they set their sights on the ailing Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Poland was a melting pot of people and had a wonky and vulnerable government that made it a hotspot for chaos. In 1772, Frederick, alongside the Austrians and Russians, got together and divided Poland, the first partition out of 3. Austria had to drop their dreams of Silesia and focus on the Ottoman Empire at their doorstep. The war shifted the power dynamics, further weakening Austria's hegemony in Germany and seeing the countless German principalities increasingly doing their own thing. Maria Theresa focused on internal changes. Before the war, Russia held an isolationist foreign policy towards Europe, but the war changed that. Russia mingled more with the other countries, and through this, continued the process of modernization and beefed up their army. The reforms made during the 7 Years' War allowed Russia to crush the Ottoman Turks in future wars. With the end of the 7 Years' War, it can be said with confidence that Great Britain was the major winner of the war. Britain's victories in India arguably began the predominance of the East India Company. For the next century, the EIC dominated the entirety of the subcontinent through direct government or close-knit vassalage, free from any commercial or political competition from other European powers. The extinction of New France extended British North America all the way west to the banks of the Mississippi. For Anglo-American settlers, the Treaty of Paris got rid of the constant worry about the French showing up unannounced on their doorstep. For the First Nations living in this new frontier, this was bad news. Before the Treaty of Paris, the First Nations were masters at playing the French and the British against each other. This clever game let them get the best deals they could get in treaties and protect their lands from colonists sneaking in. Now, the First Nations lost their ability to juggle the two European players. Despite all the benefits for Britain, they had some money troubles, thanks to war debt. The new Sugar and Stamp Acts, imposed on the Anglo-Americans, looked to relieve the war debt by heavily taxing them. Paired with attempts to stop colonists from settling past the Appalachian Mountains, this generated discontentment between the colonists and the central government, a sound foundation for a revolution.